Hi guys, Erin here. In this video, we're going to be talking about different research designs and strategies that you could use if you were interested in evaluating the effectiveness of a particular program, a treatment program. So this could be an educational program, mental health intervention, sports program, any program that is currently being implemented in the real world. So you as a researcher don't have very much control over who's receiving the program or who's not, but you still want to see whether the program is associated with some sort of learning or gains, whether kids make improvement. In doing so, we're going to be talking about the difference between non-experiments and quasi-experiments, which differ in their internal validity, or the extent to which the researcher makes some attempt to control for possible confounding variables that could provide an alternative and equally viable explanation for the results. I think this video is going to be really important for you, for your research proposal, well, for many of you, and for your future work with children. It's my hope that by the end of this video, you're going to be able to read a research study, be able to know what to look for in the methods section so that you can ask questions like, is there a control group? Are there measurements taken at different points in time? Is there some attempt to ensure that the groups are at least somewhat equivalent? So that you could be able to determine for yourself whether to trust the results of that research study. So let's get started. Here's where this video fits in the context of the videos for this week. Here's where it fits in the context of the research process and our course. So this is a table from your textbook. It lays out different non-experiments and quasi-experiments grouped based on whether they're comparing groups of people or the same people over time. It's a lot, I know. I'm hoping that this video will help you to be able to compare and contrast these designs, and importantly, be able to determine which is a non-experiment and which is a quasi-experiment. So I'm going to use the example of how we could measure improvements in reading outcomes in children. This is really important. A few years ago in Ontario, the Human Rights Commission conducted an investigation and revealed their Right to Read report, which basically shows that schools in Ontario may not be meeting the needs of many children who struggle with learning how to read and could be contributing to our high rate of dyslexia in the population. If you haven't heard of this report and you're thinking of going on to education, career in education in Ontario, pause the video right now and add to your to-do list that you should definitely check this out. This report made a number of recommendations, including that all children in Ontario should have access early on to evidence-based intervention that is implemented in their school. Now, I want you to imagine for a second that you're actually working in a school and you're thinking of implementing a particular program, and you want to be able to determine whether this program works. So whether children's reading skills are going to improve if they receive this particular intervention in their schools. Well, there are 3 steps to being able to answer this question. The first would be to look to previous research to find an evidence-based reading intervention that's been shown in very carefully controlled research settings to actually improve reading outcomes in children that have a similar demographic profile as kids at your school. Step 2 then would be to conduct a natural experiment where you would implement the program in your school and then look to see to what extent children improve. So in many cases in applied educational or mental health kind of research, we can't control who is getting the program and who's not. But we can still take steps to measure and control for possible third variables to ensure that they aren't confounds in our design and can't provide an alternative or equally viable explanation for the results. So they can't explain children's improved reading outcomes. When we control for these, then we can be more confident that's the intervention that's actually working. Step 3, which we're not going to talk about in this video, but which you might talk about in your future courses, would be then to use the results to inform future practice. So you'd look to see to what extent do you see a benefit in your kids? If yes, keep going with what you're doing. If not, then it might inform what kind of tweaks you might want to do to the implementation of that program or the selection of which children are receiving it. So in this video, we're going to be talking in more depth in step 2 and how different research designs that are either better or worse and why. Okay, so let's get started with the first one. One way that we could determine or attempt to determine whether an educational program works would be to compare reading skills in kids, let's say grade 2 kids who are identified as struggling readers and who are receiving intervention in their schools. We could test them at the beginning and end of the program. To take an example that's local to here in the Niagara region, the Niagara Catholic Board is currently implementing a program called the Empower Reading Program. It was developed by researchers and clinicians at Sick Kids Hospital. There's a link here if you'd like to check it out. The Niagara Catholic Board trains their learning resource teachers in what the program is and how to implement it. Kids receive the program for 1 hour a day, every day of the week from the fall to the spring. So we could take those kids that are receiving the program and test their reading skills at the beginning and end and measure how much change they showed, how much learning and improvement they showed. This is called a pre-test post-test design because we're measuring reading pre and post intervention. We can't control the order of testing. All kids are getting tested first in the fall, then in the spring. This differs from what we'll be talking about in future weeks in the context of a within subjects experiment. And also key to this design is there's no control group. There's no other group that's not receiving the intervention that we could compare them to. So with this kind of design, can we confidently determine whether the program works? If we see an improvement between the fall and in the spring in our kids who get the intervention, can we conclude it's because of the intervention? Well, to answer this question and to answer whether this is a non-experiment or a quasi-experiment, in other words, a bad or a good design, you want to ask yourself, what's the confound? What are some other things that could change in kids between September and June that could impact their reading scores and that have nothing to do with intervention? We call these time-related threats to internal validity. Well, I'll give you some of them here. It could be that kids might have improved in their reading skills even without intervention. We have no control group in this design, which is a really, really bad thing because we have no way of knowing whether the improvement that our kids who got intervention is actually greater than they might have shown had they not received intervention. It could also be that kids just get better at taking the reading test and that what we're measuring here is just the practice effect of taking the test twice. We could also be measuring something called the placebo effect, just the idea of being identified as special enough to get this small group instruction in a special setting could be what contributes to the higher improvement or higher reading scores. This is called the placebo effect. We don't know, we have no control group who's receiving a different intervention to know whether it's the content of the intervention that's really working. All of these terms we're going to talk more about them in our course. If you'd like to learn more, check out chapter 8 for more information about time-related threats to internal validity and chapter 7 for more information about the placebo effect. So this kind of design, a pre-test, post-test design where we don't have a control group, is really not that great. We don't know whether any improvement that our kids who got the intervention is actually due to the intervention. So this design's pretty low in internal validity. This is a non-experiment. The kind of conclusions that we could draw from this kind of design are very limited. We could say that reading scores are higher in our kids at the end compared to the beginning of intervention, but we cannot say it's because of the intervention. So this is a non-experiment. Okay, let's talk about another way we could ask and address whether an educational program works. We could compare reading skills in our grade 2 kids who are struggling readers who attend a school that offers intervention and test them at the end of the year and compare them to kids that attend a school that don't get intervention. So to use an example locally, we could test kids at the Niagara Catholic Board after they get intervention and compare them to kids at the DSBN who don't receive any consistent evidence-based treatment. Let's just pause for a sec and take that in, how there's this difference between school boards. that's another point that we can talk about at our next meeting. In this kind of design, we're comparing these two groups of kids at one point in time after one group gets intervention and after compared to a group that didn't get intervention. So this is called a post-test only non-equivalent control group design. Both groups are compared on some outcome variable, the dependent variable. In our Niagara Catholic board, we're measuring them after intervention. That's why it's called a post-test only. There's no random assignment to groups. One group just happens to be at a school that offers the intervention, and one group just happens to be at a school that doesn't offer the intervention. So we have a control group here, but there is no attempt to ensure that the groups are equivalent. So what kind of design is this? Is it a non-experiment or a quasi-experiment? Can we be confident that any difference between groups is really due to the treatment? Well, to answer this question, you want to ask yourself, what is a possible confound in the design? In other words, what are some ways that the groups could differ that have nothing to do with the intervention and which could explain a difference in their reading scores? Ideally, you would pause the video here and see if you could think of some on your own. Go for it. Well, here are some ideas. They could be related to the school or to the, for example, if kids at Niagara Catholic just happen to be in a smaller class with a higher teacher to student ratio than kids at the DSBN, well, that could provide an alternative explanation for the higher reading scores. The kids themselves might differ. It could just be that kids that are at the Catholic school come from homes where there's more money, there's more education, there's more time for the parents to invest in helping their children learn to read. If we don't measure SES in our two groups and we don't know whether it's different, that could provide an alternative explanation for the higher reading skills in the kids at the Niagara Catholic that has nothing to do with the intervention they received at their schools. Another important thing that is not being measured in this design is what their reading skills were at the beginning of the program. This is really important because we don't know, maybe the kids at Niagara Catholic were better even before they began the intervention. Without some measure of improvement over time, measuring reading before and after the program in the two groups, we really have no way of knowing that if we see a difference between the two groups at post-test, whether it's really due to the intervention. So if kids also differ in these other extraneous variables, well, this is a huge confound, and we can't be sure that it's the intervention that actually is causing the improved reading skills. We'll be talking more about these possible confounding variables and ways to control them in the next few weeks. If you're interested in learning more about them now, check out Chapter 7 of your textbook. So this kind of design, post-test only non-equivalent control group design, is an example of a non-experiment. There's no random assignment to groups. There's no pretest, no control for possible confounding variables. We're just measuring reading outcomes in June in these two groups. We really have no way of knowing if the Niagara Catholic board is better, whether it's because of the intervention. So this is not a great design. It's an example of a non-experiment because it's so low on internal validity. We'd have to be very careful about the conclusions that could be drawn from this kind of design. We could say that reading scores are higher in kids that received intervention at this school compared to this school, but we can't say it's because of the intervention. So how can we do better? How can we at least control for some of these threats? Well, in an ideal world, we would do an experiment where we, as the researcher, would randomly assign kids to the different groups, control for all possible confounds, measure reading scores at the beginning and end of the intervention, because this would allow us to really be confident that any improvement that we see in our intervention group is really due to the intervention. So this would be how we would do an experiment, and we'll be learning more about that in the next few weeks. This is not always possible in experimental settings, but what we can do is a quasi-experiment. It's kind of middle of internal validity and does the best that we can if we're working with kids who are already being assigned to particular groups. If we can't tell kids to go to one school or another, we've just got to measure the kids that are already there. So I'm going to give you an example of two quasi-experiments that are at least moving towards higher internal validity. So what we could do is basically a combination of those two other non-experiments that I just told you about. We could compare reading skills in grade 2 students that are struggling readers that are either at a school that offers the intervention or at a school that doesn't, and we test them both at the beginning and after intervention. So we'll take kids at Niagara Catholic and kids at DSBN, and we're going to measure them in the fall and in the spring. So this is called a pretest post-test non-equivalent control group design because we're comparing two non-equivalent groups at 2 points in time. One is measured before and after intervention. Another control group is not receiving intervention, or even better, would receive some intervention that's different in content than the intervention we're interested in, and is also being tested at the 2 points in time. So you can see this as a visual here. The 0 would be the 2 points in testing, and we've got one group that gets the intervention and one group that doesn't. This is classified as a quasi-experiment because we're attempting to limit some threats of internal validity. We've got a control group and we're measuring change over time. This kind of design is also called a factorial design. If you're interested in doing this for your research proposal, and I would suggest you would if you're interested in examining effects of treatment in a real world setting. The way that we would go about evaluating change is a little bit more complicated because we've got the two groups and two testing points. So if this is what you're thinking of doing for your research proposal, I'd suggest you check out in advance chapter 11, also the videos about factorial design so that you can have a sense of how to phrase it in your research proposal. We'll also be talking about it more in the next few weeks. So I'm going to give you an example from a research study that was published in a highly reputable journal called the Journal of Educational Psychology that did just this. They did a pretest, post-test non-equivalent control group design. They recruited children that were either at a school that offered intervention or at a school that didn't offer intervention. So this is why it's not an experiment, because we can't control who's getting what. But in this design, they measured reading in their two groups at 2 points in time, before and after intervention. And importantly, before the intervention started, they thought about which kids they would select to be part of their study and matched the kids, matched the groups so that they were equivalent on other variables that could also impact their reading scores. So here's a table from the study. We've got the intervention kids here and the control group kids here. And you could see that they are similar in terms of how old they are, what their reading scores were at the beginning of intervention, what their intelligence and their vocabulary is at the beginning of intervention, and the proportion of males to females, how old they are, what grade they're in, and their SES. So this is a really great design because we're measuring our two groups at 2 points in time, and the researchers have taken steps to try to make the groups as equivalent as possible. We're going to be talking more about this procedure of matching, so how to control for this extraneous variables and try to ensure our groups are as equivalent as possible in the next few weeks. So I'll just show you the results of this study. Here we're showing in light gray kids that received the control condition, so not our intervention kids. In the dark gray are the kids that received treatment. And what we're measuring here is the adjusted post-test score. So it's their scores at the end of intervention, taking into account what their score was at the beginning of intervention. So it's basically a measure of how much change they showed throughout the time period. And you can see that the group that didn't receive intervention made much less change than the group who did. So the conclusion from this study still has to be nuanced, but at least because of all these steps to try to improve the internal validity, it's getting a little bit closer to being able to say that the intervention is what is leading, that the intervention really works. So the conclusion that they drew was that children who received intervention showed a greater improvement in the reading skills than kids who didn't receive intervention, and that this change is related to, could be linked to, is associated with receiving the intervention. We still have to be very careful and not say that it's the intervention that worked and that caused the improvement, but we can feel a little bit more confident because it's a quasi-experiment, that's the case. So this would be a really great chance to pause this video. I know that we've just covered a lot of content, and for you to answer some of these questions. Really be able to say, well, why is a pretest post-test non-equivalent control group design so much better than those other designs? Why is it important to have a pretest and measure reading at different points in time? And why is it important to have a control group? And we'll talk about it in our next class. Okay, I'm going to show you one final way that we could determine whether an educational program works and how we would do this if we can't have a control group. So if it's not possible to compare it to kids that don't receive intervention. What we could do is measure reading outcomes at many points in time. So we could take our grade 2 kids that are struggling readers and give them intervention in grade 2. But if we could also have measures of their reading at many points in time before they get intervention, maybe even many points in time during the intervention, and then at many points in time after the intervention. So it would be a sort of different question that we'd be asking, whether the improvement they made during their intervention year is greater than any change they would have shown before the program. This can, and whether that improvement continued in the years after. So this is called the time series design because a series of observations are made, not just one, for each intervention, each participant's both before and after intervention. This is considered a quasi-experiment. Because we've got these multiple testing points, it's possible for us to see trends in the data. We can see a pattern of how much improvement the kids were making both before and after the program, which can make us more confident that any change we see, well, it's contextualized in the amount of learning they showed both before and after. So this would inform our understanding of whether the educational program actually worked. I'm going to show you an example from a research project that I was involved in and with the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board and Sick Kids Hospital. In this study, we had 700 kids in grade 2 or grade 3 who got intervention in their schools. We weren't able to compare reading outcomes in our kids compared to those in a control group because the school board thought it would be unethical to withhold intervention from kids that could have benefited from it. So we weren't able to control outcomes compared to a control group. We couldn't randomly assign kids to get the intervention. But we did have reading scores for each of the kids for many years before and after intervention. So using a time series design, we were able to track whether the improvement that kids showed during their intervention year was greater than the pattern of improvement they showed both before and after. This allowed us to ask whether receiving intervention in their schools was associated with a long-term shift in their reading trajectories. So I'll just show you one of the results from this study. This is what I'm going to show you results of developmental reading assessments, the DRA scores, so reading scores. And on the y-axis, on the x-axis, we've got the many different points in time that reading was assessed. The gray bars are what kids should be reading to be at grade level. So any kid that is within the gray bar is reading at grade level. These are the recommended benchmarks. And here's our results. So we've got reading outcomes in the kids who got intervention in grade 2. And you can see in the years before intervention, their rate of change is pretty flat. The slope of this line is pretty flat, and they're not meeting grade level expectations. You see this big jump in scores in the year they received intervention. And in the years after intervention, this increased rate of change continued to be there. So by the end of grade 5, 2 out of 3 children who got intervention in grade 2 were now reading at grade level. So the conclusions that we could draw from this, again, we had to be nuanced because it was a quasi-experiment, was that we saw faster rate of learning during the intervention years compared to before the intervention, and that the conclusion we drew was that there was long-term shifts in children's reading trajectories that was linked, that was related to, that was associated to receiving the intervention. So this time series design is another kind of quasi-experiment that you could do, and particularly in cases where you don't have a control group. So in this video and in the previous video, we've talked about these different designs that are typically used in education or applied research. I hope that it helped clarify some of the differences between them, and that a goal for you then would be able to say which are non-experiments, which are quasi-experiments, and why. So to summarize, what are the differences between non-experiments and quasi-experiments? Well, in many ways, they're very similar. They have the same goal, which is to describe the relationship between two variables as they exist in the real world, the relationship between intervention and reading outcomes. We've got the same kind of data, so we're comparing groups of kids or a group of kids over time, and one variable is used to group the children, uses the nominal scale, and the other variable is measured in a more continuous way using the ratio or interval scale. This kind of design also has the same benefit. Because we're not manipulating anything, we're measuring kids in a program that they would receive in the real world. It's more likely that our results are going to generalize to other situations that also exist in the real world. So both of these designs are quite high on external validity. They differ, however, in where they fall in this scale of internal validity. So whereas non-experiments make no attempt to measure or control for possible confounding variables, in a quasi-experiment, which is also called a natural experiment, we're trying to do the best that we can and to think about possible confounding variables, to measure them in our design, and to control for them. So whereas a non-experiment is very low on internal validity, a quasi-experiment is a little bit higher. In the next few weeks, we're going to talk about experiments, which fall on the high end of internal validity. So to summarize, non-experiments and quasi-experiments, you've learned about lots of different designs. They're very similar in the kind of research questions they try to answer, the kind of data they use, and they're both quite high in external validity. What makes them different, however, is that quasi-experiments are better able to answer their research questions because they have higher internal validity. Whenever possible, you want to choose a quasi-experiment. For your research proposal, don't say you're doing a non-experiment, say you're doing a quasi-experiment. And when you're reading research studies, look to make sure that what you're reading is a quasi-experiment, because you can feel more confident that you can trust those results. That's all for this video. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time.